Welcome to The Other 51, the podcast where we get your favorite writers to spill all their secrets and make you a better writer yourself. My name is Brian Moritz. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me wherever you get your podcasts. And this week, very delighted to have one of my good friends and one of the best feature writers in sports journalism today from ESPN.com, Sam Borden. Welcome back to the show.
Brian, thanks. That's very kind of you. And, I really appreciate getting the chance to talk with you.
Same. And we're going to get to our main topic in a second here, but I did just want to ask, you're coming off of a fantastic assignment in the last month or so where you covered the Special Olympics in Italy. And I'm just curious, not just as a journalist, but as a human, given everything going on in the world these days, what was it like to be at the Special Olympics and be able to cover that?
Yeah, it was. Thanks for asking. It was a really wonderful experience. It was my first time covering the Special Olympics. As a dad, in our community, my kids are involved in unified theater, unified track. One of the nice things about where I live in Connecticut is that there really is a lot of inclusion for kids of school age. So I'd had that sort of experience of seeing them have those moments, in a performance or a meet. But this was my first experience on a, massive scale, winter games, people and athletes from countries all over the world. And I have to say, it was really uplifting. I mean, it's exactly what you would imagine. As we'll talk about, I was coming off spending 6 months or so working on a really heavy story, really emotional story that had a lot of personal connections to me. As well as sort of dropping into reporting on the plane crash that happened, I think it was in February, where, a number of figure skaters were on that. And so I'd really been spending a lot of time dealing with subject matter that was really tough to process. And I think if my wife were here, she would say that, it definitely wore on me. You could see that as I was sort of carrying it all around, and having a chance to go and spend, a week and a half in Italy with Special Olympics athletes and their families and their loved ones, and just sort of appreciate the joy that existed in those moments was really nice. I mean, it was tough to be away. It's always tough for me to travel away from my family, but to go to that kind of venue and that kind of event was really wonderful. And it was really heartening to see that much happiness and joy and just sort of pride in being able to take part in something like that.
So the story you mentioned is why I have you on this week. It's something we do every now and then on The Other 51, where I do a deep dive into a specific piece that a journalist wrote or a book that they've written, and want to talk to you about probably my favorite sports story that I have read throughout the year. Favorite is a weird term given the subject material, but I think it was a beautifully done story. It's called Love, Abby, inside UConn basketball's eternal bond with a magical fan, about a young woman named Abby Zittoun who passed away from cancer, and the connection that she had with this year's UConn women's basketball team, which, as we're recording this, is just coming off of a dominant Final Four weekend, winning the national championship. We talked about this briefly before we hit record, how deeply personal it was for me in a lot of ways. And I know a lot of people have written you about it, but can you sum up what the reaction to the story has been like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. I think it hit a lot of our audience in exactly the way that you would expect, people that were UConn fans or are UConn fans, I think appreciated the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the human beings that Paige Beckers and Azzi Fudd and Caroline Ducharme and the rest of the team are. I mean, they have an incredible fame, for what they do on the court. I think UConn women's basketball is certainly one of the most recognizable programs, and Paige Beckers is, among the most recognizable athletes in the country. And so having the opportunity to learn more about what makes them human, I think, was really fascinating for a lot of folks. And then, as I was saying to you before, there was a really overwhelming number of readers who wrote to me and shared their personal experiences with cancer in their family, cancer with a child that they loved. A lot of them were, happy endings in terms of, oh, my son or my daughter went through this and is still, still going, still alive, beat it 10 years ago, beat it 20 years ago. And so I think that, being able to get into and describe what the experience is like for a family that is dealing with something like that, something that, was in a lot of ways, directing what they could do, what they couldn't do for 7 years. Sadly, that's not a unique experience to the Zittoun's. And so there were a lot of people that I think felt seen, felt acknowledged, felt validated by reading what had happened to Abby and the Zittoun family, and appreciated, I think, at least what I hope is a pretty raw and, true, genuine depiction of what that experience is like.
So let's go back to the beginning. How did you find out about this story?
Yeah, it's an interesting one from a journalistic perspective. My wife and I went to college together. We went to Emory University at the end of the 90s. And in my wife's sorority, one of our friends at that time was Gwen. She was Gwen Goodman at the time, now Gwen Zittoun. But, she's a couple years older than us. We certainly knew her. We were certainly close with her in college. And then, like anybody, you graduate, you move on. We're on Facebook. I think we were all vaguely aware of what everybody was doing, but we're not particularly close until my wife and I moved to Connecticut after I finished my my assignment overseas for the New York Times. We moved to Connecticut after coming back from Europe, and reconnected with Gwen at that time. And right around that time is when Abby was first diagnosed. And so very quickly after reconnecting with her as friends, we were experiencing, this situation that our friends were going through. And I'm going to sort of zoom through the next, 7 years, but I think to your question, this is an honest, an honest statement. I never really thought about it as something I would ever do a story on. I didn't even really think of it in terms of a story, which is crazy because I spend a lot of my time walking around thinking, okay, what's my next project? Where am I going to go? What can I pitch? And these were just our friends. These are people that we love, Dan and Gwen, the kids, like our kids came close with them. So it was just not something that was really on my radar in that way. It was just, these are people that we care about and, want to support. As is often the case with, I think, a lot of journalists. I have an editor. Her name is Susie Arth. I talk to her all the time, not only about what's going on in my professional life, but also what's going on just in my life. And so she was aware, especially as Abby's condition, worsened, and particularly once she went into the hospital for the last time, like I was telling Susie what was going on because it was what was going on in my life. And so after Abby died, we went to the funeral again, just as as a friend would. And maybe like 3 or 4 days after the funeral, Susie said to me, like, have you ever thought about this as a story? Do you think the Zittouns would be interested? And my initial reaction was like, I don't know whether they'd be interested, but I'm not even sure I'm interested. Like we were really grieving like we had become very close. We visited Gwen and Dan in the hospital and sat in the same room with them and Abby the same way the players did, like maybe a day or two before the players. I don't remember the timing, but like we did that as friends. You know what I mean? Like we were there sitting with them because we care about them. And so it wasn't something that I was necessarily interested in doing, but we talked about it. I talked about it with Jessica, my wife. What do you think? Do you think how do you think they would react? And then I talked about it with Gwen and Dan, and just like, hey, this was suggested to me. I want to bring it to you, and, you can throw it away or, think about it or whatever. And they thought about it. We talked through. I explained, what would go into it. How do I work? I mean, they've read my work. They know the kinds of stories that I've done. They've read me do sad stories and happy stories and hard stories. And so it wasn't like they were unfamiliar with what the final product could look like, but I think letting them and allowing them to understand what it feels like to sort of open up your life to a journalist was a big hurdle along the way. And so those conversations took a little while, but ultimately they agreed. I think they felt like, having something with permanence, was something they were interested in, having something that sort of captured this moment, that captured what the players felt was important to them. And so ultimately they agreed, but it was not, it's a unique circumstance for me, certainly, and not one that I had any experience with before doing this.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss and your family's loss too.
Thank you.
That's hard. So those conversations that you were having, obviously, maybe not, shouldn't say obviously, but you have to let them lead in this, right? I mean, and so how did you balance that as both their friend and as you're pitching it, as both their friend and also as the journalist, seeing
Yeah.
the story this is, but kind of I'm assuming letting them lead and kind of letting them as much as possible guide the process.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's, the approach that I take with anybody who's, I mean, talking about something that would make them vulnerable or traumatic or emotional, obviously is always to try to come to them on their terms because, selfishly, that's where you're going to get the most authentic reactions. Obviously, you don't want anyone to feel pressured into a particular emotion or sentiment because then it's not real. And so that was no different than anything that I've ever done, that's of a similar, emotional vein. I think the biggest thing that I wanted to impress on them as a friend, as a journalist for sure, but also as a friend, was that when you agree to these kinds of stories, you give up the right to control it because you're having somebody, in this case, me, sort of the prism through which the audience gets to experience it. But even more, and this was the point that I made to them, the players, right? The players are as much a part of the story as Abby was. And they may have experienced their relationship with Abby in a way that you, Gwen and Dan, didn't realize, maybe wouldn't necessarily have thought about, wouldn't necessarily have been happy about. I mean, who knows? At the beginning, we don't know what they thought of Abby, like we have a sense from their experiences, but like I'm going to ask them questions and Gwen and Dan are not going to get to, sort of change those answers. However they answer is what their experience was. And so giving up that control is really hard. And I wanted them to understand. I mean, it's something that and I think anybody who's done these kinds of stories has come into contact with. Afterwards a story is published or it airs on television and you hear from the main character, I had no idea they felt that way, or I can't believe they said that,
Mhm.
or they told that story, I can't believe they shared that with you. Like, you don't get to control that. And so that was the number one thing. I said, like, this is your daughter, this is her experience and her life and her, the memories of what she did, and you right now, you get to control how you think about that. If we do this, you give up a tiny piece of that control, and that may be okay with you, that may not be okay with you, but I really wanted them to understand what that meant, because as a friend, I could see, down the line, having to be supportive if they didn't like it, and I wanted them to avoid that situation if they thought it was going to make them uncomfortable. So that was really the number one thing that I tried to explain. And then the rest of it is just like mechanical, like stupid stuff, like, oh, I'm going to ask you to remember in detail things that, like, maybe you don't even care about the details, and you might not even understand why it's important, but my experiences as a writer, like, the little tiny details are what make these things feel real. So I might ask you, like, what was, like, what was the type of jerky that you bought at the rest stop with Abby on the drive back from the Final Four? And you may be like, well, who cares? But I'm going to care. And so if that's going to be annoying to you, like, let's talk about that now, that kind of stuff. And so, it took a little while. I mean, we went through all of that. We talked about what that would look like. We talked about, we did a TV version, what it would look like to do it on camera. It's different when you're sitting across the table, at my kitchen table, which you've sat at a million times, and talking to me, somebody you talked to a million times. It's different when there's 6 people that you don't know in the room, and lights and a camera and a producer. And so trying to explain what that looked like, all of that. I do that with subjects all the time, but it was different here because, it was somebody who I have a vested interest in their sort of emotional well-being.
So how did you, well, I want to get back to the details question because that was a big part of what I wanted to talk about, a big part of the story. But in terms of getting started in the reporting, and not just with the family, but with the UConn players, like how did the reporting process for this unfold? Once you kind of had them on board and you knew that you were going to do the story, what were the next steps? How did you reach out to the team? How did those interviews look? How did the reporting of this come together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that For sure, we started with the family because if they were not interested, then obviously it doesn't go anywhere. Once I had a sense that they would be open to exploring this, we reached out to UConn, and their initial reaction was like, "Well, we're not doing it if the family's not doing it." And I was like, "Well, the family's okay, but they want to make sure you guys are okay." There was a lot of like, which is wonderful, and I think speaks to the connection that the family has with the players and the program. Everybody was very aware of the other side's emotional investment, and so navigating that took a little bit of time. But I think ultimately the biggest concern that the players had, and they said this to me even when we were sitting in the interview chair with them on campus, was like, this was not, and I think I even wrote this in the story, this was not a university mandated thing. This was not hey, we're all going to the hospital to hang out with the kids who are sick today. Like they looked at Abby and, the Zittouns as friends, as people they cared about, as people that they loved. They connected with them. They texted with her. They had a relationship beyond sort of the typical philanthropy that a pro team or a big time college team would do. And so they were not interested in magnifying that for PR purposes. You know what I mean? This was not something that they were thinking of in that way, or ever wanted anyone to get the impression that they were thinking of in that way. And so, that took some conversation too, because, it can feel that way sometimes when you see content around those sorts of moments. And I had to sort of say to them, look, here's my body of work. Take a look at the stories that I have done about hard subjects in the past or similar subjects like this in the past. If you feel like that's how it comes off, then let's talk about it. Hopefully, I mean, obviously in the end they didn't, but I think, hopefully my work on these kinds of subjects in the past maybe helped smooth that over a little bit, or allay that concern a little bit. And then a lot of it is just sort of talking to them about it and saying like, I hear where you're coming from, and that's not what we're trying to do here, And so it definitely on the player side, that was the biggest obstacle. Once we got past that, they were incredibly available and really open and vulnerable when we sat with them, which was wonderful to see. And I think made me feel like there was a certain authenticity that I think as a cynical journalist, you're always sort of like, yeah, okay, how real is this? And I think I and the producer, Alex Nolan, who I worked with on the television version, both of us are experienced. Certainly both of us have been around plenty of athletes who maybe you would question the authenticity or the genuine nature of their feelings. Walking away from the UConn players, I think we both felt, wow, that was as authentic or as genuine an experience I've ever felt with an athlete before.
And it's something the way you're talking about it, I realize, and obviously we both teach at St. Bonaventure in the master's program. This isn't something traditional journalism school prepares you for. Is the kind of like negotiation before the interview, or the kind of talking about the process with sources or with people who you're going to talk to before the story. It's not a lot about just how to conduct the interview or just scheduling the interview, like the mechanics of it, but the discussion of it and the discussion of this is why we're doing the story. This is what the process looks like. I'm going to annoy you with details questions, and hearing them, I think it's just an interesting thing to think about. It's one of those soft skills that in journalism, especially the longer form stories, I think is so important.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that, I mean, I wish it was. And certainly when I talk to classes or university groups or, students or young journalists, I do stress that element of transparency because I think, especially nowadays, it's incredibly important. And look, I'm very blessed and I'm very lucky to have now a body of work that I can point to. I mean, I've done a lot of hard stories or I've done a lot of different types of stories. So I can often point to somebody and say, hey, look, read this. Tell me, tell me if you have concerns after reading it, and then let's talk about it. But even without that, I think when you're talking to somebody and asking them for access to their emotions, to their feelings, to their experiences, to their memories, that's an intimate request. And so it's one that requires from you, the journalist, a similar level of intimacy. And so my feeling is that by opening the door to my process, here is what you can expect. Here is how I try to go about doing this. Here is how I'm going to try to help you unpack the experience that you had in a way that will resonate with people who don't know you. I feel like that transparency is sort of my version or, my equivalent intimacy to them. Like I don't ever want somebody to feel like, oh, he's going to talk to me, go away, wave a magic wand, and all of a sudden this thing is going to appear on ESPN.com. Like that isn't how it works, A. And B, I don't want them to feel like it's that easy that I'm processing, like dropping all their ingredients into a blender, blending it up, and then here, hey, look what we have, like that isn't how it works. And so by opening the door to what I'm going to need, what I'm going to ask them for, I feel like it's, sort of like a way of maybe holding their hand a little bit and saying like, we're going to do this together, as opposed to it's going to be a transactional type of thing.
Mhm. You had mentioned the details early, and obviously this piece is full of just those incredibly specific details. And obviously the importance of those is that they bring the reader into the story. They see you there, and the Paige Becker's texting or math texting Abby, math is the worst. Just there's the one of the many that stood out that I remember from this. So kind of a two-pronged question for you here, Sam. What kind of details are you looking for? And then I think kind of the larger question, how do you know what's the right balance of too much detail? Like what are you looking for? What's the right detail to include in a story?
It's a great question because a lot of times when I will read, well, I mean, I was going to say, younger journalists work, but the truth is, I think it's not only younger journalists. That is a really hard line. Any writer, sometimes you're kind of like, I don't care if she has her hair in a ponytail or a bun, you know what I mean? But to your point, like that text or, the one that I love as a father myself is, when Dan got Abby the Burger King crown,
Yes. Hmm.
like what an amazing thing, what a thing that like so many dads would think to do, but what a perfect thing for him to have done in that moment, And so you're right, like it is a fine line between like okay man, I don't need this much detail about like, the temperature in the room. But I guess the thing that I would say is like what are the details that are evocative, right? I mean, they're I think it's a little bit of a cliche and probably like a harmful cliche as a writer to think, okay, I want to paint a picture because you don't want to paint a picture. You know what I mean? Like if you're painting a picture, then you have to paint in all of the tiny details. And a lot of those details don't matter. And so when I am thinking about it as a writer, I don't really think in terms of like, let me get these details that will help me paint a picture. I'm thinking of these details. I'm thinking, let me get these details that will tell me something, or really show me something, right?
Hmm.
Show, don't tell. And so I ask for, and I'm sure if Dan or Gwen were on this podcast, they would say that I ask for a million details, many of which probably are that small, worthless to the reader kind. But you sort of have to volume shoot a little bit, I think, and then you go through and figure out, okay, well, what if these details says something, it's harder when you have a restricted amount of time. Like obviously with Dan and with Gwen, I mean, both because of who they are and my relationship with them, I had more time with them than I did with Paige Beckers. So in the circumstance of like Paige Beckers, okay, a lot of that is just experience, let me press on one small thing and see if it pans out, and if it does, okay, that's going to be something I'm going to try to use. I think something that's a little bit underrated a lot of times in these kinds of stories is the order in which you do your interviews. And so in this particular example, I was able to do a fairly long sit down with Gwen and with Dan first, knowing that I was going to have limited time with Paige and with AZ and with Caroline. And that allowed me to go into those interviews like aware of the details that I was thin on, or the moments that I was going to want a perspective on. Like I knew that the bat mitzvah and the players coming to the bat mitzvah, that was going to be something, I mean, I was there, so I saw them dancing. I was able to, see it with my own eyes. But even without that, I would have known right away, like, okay, this is different. We're going to need this, right? So that was one. Let me find out from them. What were you guys talking about? You've never been to a bat mitzvah. What were you texting about? That ends up being the lead of the whole story, like what shoes do we wear to a bat mitzvah party? Like literally, like that kind of uncertainty. And, I knew from the beginning that was going to be something. So let me press on that with Paige. Let me press on that with AZ. You know what I mean? And so some of that's experience. Some of it is strategy in terms of when do you interview people in relation to the other people that are involved in the story. And then the truth is, some of it is like good fortune, I guess. Like you volume shoot enough, you ask for enough, and then at the end you find something that is evocative of the sentiment that you're trying to share.
It's a good segue into the writing of the piece too, because the reporting is its own thing, but obviously taking all of this information, all this story, all these details, and writing them down. And you mentioned the bat mitzvah, and I just love the parallel structure of the bat mitzvah and then the funeral at the end, where you have the really really tall guests in parentheticals, and it's just a great reminder. It's a human reminder that basketball players are an absolute other species in terms of physicality. When you compared to normal people, when they walk in a room, you notice them. I thought
Yeah.
that was just really nicely done. So how did you? What was your process like for trying to figure out the structure of the story? How did you kind of take all this information and how did you crack the structure of it?
It's a good question. It's funny. It's one of those things where I think a lot of times anything creative that has those kinds of callbacks or those kinds of, payoffs, you set something up early and you pay it off later. Like, I think a lot of times I'm guilty of it too. You'll look at something and be like, oh man, like, did they think of that from the jump? Do you reverse engineer it? Do you think of the payoff first and then go back and, okay, how do I set this up? And the truth, I mean, like, at least for me, maybe this is not the case for most people, but for me, it almost never is that calculated, like, you mentioned that parenthetical. I remember writing that parenthetical, the first one about like really, really tall guests, right? With no idea at the time of writing it that the funeral would be sort of a counterbalance, or that I would come back later. I was very cognizant, I will say, during the writing of like, this is a story that readers who are not invested in UConn and or Abby, or have a sort of empathetic bone that makes them interested in this kind of experience, will want to check out of a lot. I mean, look, there's a lot of sadness in the world. I don't read as many sad stories anymore because I don't need to feel extra sadness or concern. I have enough of that in my own life. And so I'm always aware when I'm doing a story like this of like, it cannot feel like a long march. You know what I mean? It just can't. Like, nobody will get to the end if that's how it feels. And so I'm always very aware of like, can I introduce some levity? Can I introduce something that will make somebody chuckle? And with this particular story, I remember having a conversation with my editor, Susie, about this. And I said, like, I want Abby to be alive for as much of this story as possible. You know what I mean? Like, yes, there is a line in the second section that begins it. It's my little homage to Eric Segal's amazing novel Love Story. What can you say about a girl who died young? So I guess obviously that she dies in the second section, but that aside, she is alive for 90%, 95% of the story, and is very alive, is experiencing things and doing things. It is not a story about grief. It's a story about an amazing, wonderful, joyous, hilarious little girl and her fantastic family and the connection they have with these amazing players. And so I was very mindful of that. Like, I want her to be alive everywhere in this story, and so that was one thing. In terms of like the actual writing, I don't necessarily advise this all the time, but I was very familiar with the material and the interview transcripts. I had gone over the transcripts so many times. I mean, just so many times. And so when I sat to write, I didn't stop to go look up particular quotes. I mean, there aren't a ton of quotes in it, but I would just write and I would kind of like leave a space for what I felt like, okay, there's going to be a line here from Paige. I don't remember what it is exactly, but I wouldn't stop and go and find it. You know what I mean? I would just sort of like write the prose part of it beginning to end. And then I would go back through and look for the lines and put them in, which is not the way I always work. But for this one, I think, I mean, I teared up a lot, which is not always the case when I write. Obviously, I have my own connections to the people in the story. But like when I would write something that was sweet or, was emotional about Dan or about Gwen or about Abby, it was hard for me to separate that from like loving Dan and Gwen and Abby, you know what I mean? And so I would have to stop sometimes and be like, I can't, like continue writing right now because I'm not me, the writer, I'm me, the friend, And so it was really, that was hard. And I think my wife would say that I really struggled with that at times because like I tried to treat it like Sam Borden, the writer. That's why they wanted me to do it. That's why my editors wanted me to do it, is because like I can do these stories and I have done them. But it was a really hard experience for me to give it my best because I was very aware of the fact that if the subjects of the story didn't like my work, in most cases, like, I mean, that's a bummer and I'm always sad about it, but I don't have to see those people in synagogue or, like at, a party or whatever next week. Here, like, this is, if you Google Abby's name, probably for the, like the rest of Dan and Gwen's lives, like this is the story that's going to come up. And that's a lot of pressure to walk around with for a long time. And I was very aware of that pressure and it really took a toll on me for sure.
So how'd you handle that? I mean, that's a tough writing about tough subjects is always, I think we've talked about it before, is always, taxing on a journalist's mental health, but, adding the personal level to this. So how did you kind of come through to the other side on this?
I mean, I think I have some wonderful colleagues who talked me through it and said, you know, you need to have faith in yourself. You need to trust that, you've done the reporting the way you know how to do it. You've done the connecting the way you know how to do it. Trust yourself to do it. And, I mean, it sounds simple to say. And I think ultimately I knew that deep down, obviously, that this is why the Zittouns trusted me with the story. This is why, my editors thought, this is a story worth doing. I mean, I think, cynically, Brian, like there are a lot of sad stories. There are a lot of kids who get sick, who have connections to athletes. We felt this was a different story worth telling. We felt this relationship was different than the sort of, typical athlete, family who's struggling situation. And so I needed to trust that. I needed to let the story tell itself. I think in the beginning, some of my editors were like, should you be in this story? Should you make it clear to the reader what your perspective is? And I felt very uncomfortable with that from the beginning. I mean, in part, that's not my approach. I think if you look back at my body of work, I can't really think of any big stories where I am a sort of meaningful character in any of them. I know there are plenty of my colleagues who do that and do that very well. That's just not me. And I also felt like it's not relevant, like the characters here are Abby, are the players, are the Zittouns. Like, what does it matter, what my perspective is, to the average reader? So yes, like I hope that my experience as their friend and as somebody who experienced some of these, the funeral, the bat mitzvah, some of these events, I hope that that's shown through in my writing and my ability to describe it. It definitely informed the way that I wrote about the experience of Dan and Gwen trying to be a parent to a sick child and to her siblings. Some of those sections I hope were, maybe made more real by having heard about, been a support for them while they were going through it. But I didn't really feel comfortable putting myself in it. And I hope that, I mean, nobody has said, oh man, I wish I knew that, I wish that you were in there. And so hopefully that is a good indication that it was a correct choice.
So we're getting low on time here, but just wanted to ask, what was Dan and Gwen's reaction to the story once it came out?
I mean, I think that they felt like it was true. I think that they felt like it was a good encapsulation of the experience. I mean, I don't know how long the story was, however many thousands of words, but 7 years is a long time. They went through a lot, you know what I mean? And nobody is ever going to be able to make clear what that experience was like. And so what I hope I succeeded with, and I think they felt like we did, was the connection between Abby and the players was real and honest and loving and warm and genuine. And I think that came through. I hope it did. And I think they felt like it did. And if people were able to understand the value of that relationship and what it showed about the kind of person Abby was, then I guess it's a success. You'd have to ask them, but that was what I was trying to do. And, I really hope that I did.
Well, I can tell you for me it did. And I found it very interesting, too, that it was very noticeable that Gino Auriemma or no other adults from UConn were quoted, adults, administrators or coaches were quoted in the story, really kind of driving home that this was a real player thing, like a real older sister, younger sister relationship that the players had with her.
Yeah, no question.
I wanted to, so I'll get you out of here on the question I always end with. So, Sam Borden, what's the best thing that you've read lately?
Oh man, that's a really great question. It's incredibly off topic for the discussion that we've been having, but I read a really great piece in the New York Times the other day that was written by the president of Wesleyan. It was like an op-ed. And I'm forgetting his name, so if we can Google it and drop it in, that'd be great. But he wrote about the difficulties that Jews in America are facing right now as it relates to the way that the Trump administration has sort of claimed anti-Semitism and fighting against anti-Semitism as a cause that they're using to justify a lot of decisions and policies that they're putting forth. And I thought it was a really interesting encapsulation of how Jews, I am Jewish, are sort of facing that realities of anti-Semitism and then the sort of portrayals of anti-Semitism and the difficulties that, different opinions, that people with different opinions about the war in Israel might have. I thought, how that is reflected in on-campus protests, the challenges that higher education institutions are facing because of that. Like, I just thought it was a really interesting subject and a really interesting perspective from a guy who's in obviously a unique position to have a perspective on it. So that's something that, came to the front of my mind right when you asked that, probably just because it's something that I read recently. But I do think that there's a lot of fascinating journalism and writing being done around the war in Israel. Yes, but also the experience of American Jews and how they're processing what it all means.
Great. Well, so I will definitely Google that, and I'll put a link to that op-ed in the show notes, as well as a link to the piece on Abby, which also has the TV version of it, so people can watch it and read it. And Sam, well done, and thanks again for joining me. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Special thanks to Sam Borden for joining me this week. You can read his story that we talked about and all of Sam's stuff at ESPN.com and at the link in our show notes. If you like our show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Jen Moritz does our graphics. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz. I'm Brian, and I'll talk to you next time.